Thank you for all being here today. My name is Robert Tornaveni, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. A little bit of background about me. I have 30 years of law enforcement experience working for four law enforcement agencies in Illinois and Colorado, with 20 years as a PIO, and I am the host of the PIO podcast. So thank you all for attending Public Information and Transparency, the new buzzword of the 21st century. For those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please submit them using the chat feature. We will try and answer them at the end of the discussion. Now I would like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Nellie Miles. Nellie is a 24-year law enforcement executive. She serves as the Director of Public and Government Affairs for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. She oversees the state agency's external communications and legislative priorities. Adam Myrick. Since 2015, Captain Adam Myrick has served as the Public Information Officer, primary spokesperson, and media liaison for the Lexington County Sheriff's Department in South Carolina. Next, we have Katie Nelson, who currently serves as a consultant and instructor with Julie Parker Communications. She previously served for nearly a decade as a law enforcement strategic communicator with the Bay Area, California Law Enforcement Agency. Our next panelist is Tamron Olden. Tamron is the CEO and owner of Talk Public Relations, a PR firm dedicated to improving public safety, communications, and digital marketing. She has over 20 years of experience, including 16 years at a Southern California Police Department. Our last panelist is Gary Woodruff. Chief Gary Woodruff retired from the Lawrence, Indiana Police Department after 40 years of law enforcement for 3 different law enforcement agencies, 30 of those years serving as PIO and Media Relations Chief. Today, we will be discussing transparency in law enforcement. It is a word that is frequently spoken by law enforcement executives, politicians, and the public, but what does it really mean? To start off our discussion, we're going to define transparency in law enforcement. Nellie, how do you define transparency within your agency, and what strategies are employed to balance it with operational security while building public trust?
Thank you, Robert. First of all, I just want to say thank you for just the platform and the opportunity to share. Transparency has definitely been a popular word these past couple of years. And for my agency, the big thing is that people want to know what's happening with your agency. They want to know what's going on and how it's going to impact them. So if someone from the public or the media has a question, we just make sure that we put ourselves in a position to be able to answer that question. And I think that that's really the bottom line when it comes to transparency, is that you're providing information to the public and you're making it easy. You're removing all of the various roadblocks there is to getting that information out simply, and you're also very accessible. I think a key thing also is making sure that you are responsive when those inquiries come. And as far as strategies, one of the, I think, misconceptions is that transparency means that you're just giving out everything you have. You have an investigation or something's going on and you're just unloading all information. But the reality is there are a lot of cases out there. I know for my agency, we're a state criminal investigative agency, and there's information that we might give out that could essentially compromise a case. There's guilty knowledge, there's just all types of security issues that could happen that can impact and harm law enforcement if we put the information out. And so even if you can't release everything, being able to explain the reason why you're not able to release information, I think that's very key. Educating the public, educating the people that has those questions, and for us, that's what we are constantly doing. I think that this is the PIO podcast, and I think really the bottom line is having a strong public information program. In Georgia, we have over 800 law enforcement agencies. And to date, there are still so many different agencies that don't have someone who handles communications. If something happens, they're scrambling. And so that's where we really need to start, is making sure that every agency, over 18,000 agencies in this nation, that they have a public information officer position, someone who is dedicated to that, someone who is trained, someone who is constantly looking and seeking to improve their processes. For the GBI, we didn't always start out where we're at. It took time, and it takes time to build that trust. But transparency is just that. Get that information out in a timely manner. You don't have all, even if you don't have all the information, you're giving your public a reason. You're giving them information, and then you're getting back to them.
Does anybody have a follow-up to that? Go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to kind of piggyback a little bit on some of the things that Nellie talked about. She was definitely spot on, but I think that educating the public is so important because they might not understand why you can't release something. But I think the other side of it, which I'm sure a lot of you fellow PIOs can understand, is educating internally. How many times have you had a detective or even someone in command staff that tells you, don't release that, or we can't say this, or don't put this out there? Now, outside of there is holdback information, you never want to compromise integrity of investigation. But a lot of times they also don't know internally that technically that is subject to public release. We want them to hear the information from us first on our terms versus putting them through the process of obtaining sometimes a lot more than we were initially going to give out, because now they're going through a process of public records requests. And it's just a matter of not only educating the public, but also educating internally.
Okay. Anyone else? Go ahead, Kerry.
If I may, Robert, yeah, to concur with both Nellie and Tamron, and to add to that, maybe, I think having your PIO, we're talking to agency leaders here in particular, to have that public information officer having a seat at the table with your command staff, either at the command staff level or at least having a seat at the table, to me is huge. I've had that good fortune throughout my career, and having a seat at that table and being a part of those discussions, being involved with them from the beginning, I think it's a key agency investment that they can make, exactly as Tamron said and Nellie indicated as well. And investing in that position, but also in that position having a seat at that command staff level table, and having the interaction with the entirety of the agency and understanding of the entirety of the agency. I think those are some key investments that law enforcement leaders can make within their agencies to promote exactly what we're talking about here today.
Okay. Anybody else want to jump in there? All right. Adam, let's go with you. Let's start off with mechanisms and technology for transparency. Adam, what are the current policies, technologies, or practices proving effective in enhancing transparency in police agencies?
I think first and foremost, we have to go to the oldie but the goodie, and that's the website, because there's still a tremendous value in a website and tremendous value in having tools and information available on a website. And despite all the apps of all of the social media platforms that seemingly come and go, some of them from time to time, we need to make sure that we are sharing information on a website. I think that's an important thing. And let's not forget also about the good old-fashioned news release. So I think putting news release on your website, yes, I know it sounds maybe a little quaint, and to some, maybe it sounds a little passé, but there's still something very, I think, specific and also effective about doing that, because so many of our community members are still going to Google and they're still going to search. We want to make sure that our information and the reports, the news releases, and the other things that we're sharing are available on as many platforms. And again, don't forget about the website. Social media, let's continue to do that as well. But I think as a word guy, I want to the words, and that is candor and accessibility. And I think we have to maintain that sense of candor and maintain accessibility. And part of that accessibility is making sure that it's digitally available, making sure that our efforts to be transparent are something that are easy to access, and then also making sure that we're being transparent, not in a reluctant way, but in a very candid, open way. And so when we think about different strategies and tactics to use to maintain that transparency, let's remember, be accessible and also be candid, be forthright, rather than transparent, maybe in not so much of a willing fashion, but in just complying with the law. Let's be open and candid and transparent again in that forthright manner.
Agreed. Anybody would like to add to that? Go ahead, Katie.
I think I'll jump in a little bit there. When you talk about accessibility, Adam, I would agree that you have the staples of the press release and the website. What we have to understand today is how many people are utilizing digital channels to communicate. And so accessibility extends beyond what we know and what we have known. And being comfortable enough and courageous enough to go into those spaces to be able to communicate effectively and understand that every audience has its own means to an end. So some people will prefer to get information in one avenue, others will prefer to get it in another. Your tool belt is so vital to the credibility of your organization. And when we talk about transparency, time and transparency build out trust. And so the more that you invest in that over time, and Adam mentioned being, candid and forthright, those are really invaluable tips to be able to take away. Because if you hide something, your public is probably going to figure it out one way or another. And so hope is not a strategy when it comes to information release. Being sure that you are able to do what you do best and making sure that your organization, particularly your leadership, understands what is best in terms of information sharing, transparency, and that connectivity that you've built out over time are really vital to the program, especially if you have dedicated PIOs or people serving in this role.
I agree. I wanted to say one thing about this being transparent and having mechanisms in place. It would also include like transparency dashboards where you have it very easily and accessible for the public to find out what your policies are, your use of force policy, your body worn camera policy, not making it difficult for them to find them, but also then having things like access to incidents, maybe not necessarily real time, but within 30 minutes or an hour or so, where they show mapped out where incidents occur in their community. If you have that technology, I think that's important. It goes more to opening up that door to building trust with your community.
Robert, along those lines, an additional benefit to that is it can actually generate leads and tips for your agency as they are investigating incidents that have occurred. If we're out there with some of those, there's so many platforms now that help help citizens connect with their police departments and find out what's going on in their neighborhoods and areas. But it also increases the opportunity for the public to share information with us. We're always asking people, you see something, you say something. And every platform we can offer that can assist in facilitating that, I think it's a win for everyone.
I agree. Anybody else want to add into this?
I just wanted to add one additional thing is just the foundational part of updated policies and a communications plan. It is crazy to me how many agencies, especially ones that deal with the large scale incidents that are big agencies, don't even have updated policies or a communication strategy, which is setting everybody up for failure and that's setting you up for liability. So even just looking at your policies, do the standard policies through different softwares like Lexipol cover some of these topics? Absolutely. But you have to look at your department specific aspects that should be included in your policy. Even things such as your standards for and expectations and requirements for the individual who is filling the PIO and even social media manager role, because they're not the same person, will overlap, but make sure that you have something to default to use for training and to be able to use to reference if you have turnover in the position or the team grows, that you have that foundation there.
Thank you, Tamron. Nellie, go ahead.
Yeah, something came to mind. On this topic, one thing I have noticed coming from a state agency standpoint, we may be in the northern part of the state or the southern part of the state, maybe the middle part of the state. The public and the audience is different from area to area. And I think over time, if you really listen to your community members, as they're commenting and making their suggestions, you'll find, I know for our agency, we have shifted from maybe that this is where they wanted to go to get their information, and now there's a new space. And I think that will also help guide those decisions, and something that I think is very important to keep in mind as you're figuring it out. I mean, there are a lot of times where you think, well, you're putting that information out because it's what you want, but also listening to what your community is asking for in those conversations will help you propel you to that next level.
Nellie, how would you go about doing that then? Would that be
Well,
surveying the public, or how would you best do that?
Well, what the way that really been doing it is going into the comments section. I know for our agency, we would get a lot of questions because we're investigating basically all the officer involved shootings. And we would get a lot of questions from the media and the public about officer involved shootings. And like Adam alluded to, yes, we use our website, but there was a point where all of our news releases were in the same place. But 2020, I don't know if y'all remember that year, I did ask our IT people just to break out all the OISs. And so we, on the website, if you go now, you'll see, yes, we have the news releases, but here's a list of all the OISs. You can go right to it. And so that's just one example of just listening to the questions and going into those comments. I'm sure that there are really fancy surveys and tools that you can use, but for us, keeping it pretty basic and going in those questions and not just posting something and then I'm out, going in and saying, what are they asking? And because lots of times, well, based on that feedback, we'll send it back to the investigators and say, hey, we're getting this, like Chief said, tips and leads, but also suggestions or ideas.
Right. Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to jump in there? Adam, anything? Did we lose Adam there?
No, all good here.
Oh. All right, since nobody else has anything to add into that topic, we're going to jump into the next one. We're going to talk about the impact of body-worn cameras. So, Katie, how do body-worn cameras contribute to transparency and accountability, and how do agencies balance their use with legal and privacy considerations?
I think, to kind of piggyback off of what Nellie was just bringing up, and that adaptability with transparency that comes from sharing information around, especially what is captured on body-worn cameras, it really comes down to adaptability and accountability. And not only is it holding officers accountable, but it's also holding the public accountable. We are so often defined by headline culture, 7 words or less for the most part, of what is perceived to be the reality of a situation. And what I find so fascinating about officer worn cameras is how much they tell the totality of the story from start to finish. Now, tragedy and crises are sometimes mutually exclusive, but especially in a crisis, body cameras can be something that truly helps an organization. Now, there are certainly things that, at least here in California, there are laws where within 45 days, we have to release officer worn camera footage. I'm not sure if that's the same in every other state. And it certainly puts a timeline on information sharing. But I almost think that's too generous. When I teach, I often tell people, if at the 45-day mark, you haven't released it yet, and you're asking for an extension, you're possibly going to further traumatize the officers, their families, even the suspects or the suspects' families, victims. There's all these other additional components that come into that. And so when you think about how you put that information out, in reality, you probably have 3 to 10 days at most, just so you're not restarting the news cycle. That story is being packaged the way that it needs to be, told to the public in a timely and effective manner. And it's also, truthfully, showing that the agency is being as transparent as possible to the capacity that they can be. Now, that doesn't always mean that, something should be released for the sake of release. Obviously, we want to protect the integrity of the investigation, and that's where that legal component comes in. But ultimately, at least where I am, a lot of that does come out eventually. I would much rather, as an organization, be in the driver's seat of information and have, Tamron mentions policies. I can't stress that enough. Having a communication policy and strategy in place to understand both internally and externally what that's going to look like, and how ultimately you have to be mindful of constitutional rights, voir dire with the jury selection, and all that comes into how that information is displayed, and not trying to necessarily just provide opinion, but really, at the end of the day, ensuring that all of the facts are out there and that you are explaining procedures and policies to the best of your ability, so that regardless of what people feel, they at least have all of the information to formulate as complete of an opinion as possible.
Anybody like to add in? Go ahead, Nellie, and then we'll get you, Tamara.
Yeah, I'll chime in. I think that Katie brings up a really strong point when you think about laws. I have to deal with a lot of other states being a state agency, and there are just laws out there that prohibit the release of those body worn cameras. And so I think it does go back to education, because if something happens on the other side of the country, then they localize a story and they want to understand why we're not doing things like other places. Being in that position to educate them on what our processes are. I think a local law enforcement agency, they have the most pressure because they have to answer to their community. So I wouldn't expect a state agency to come in and to dictate that, because in those instances, we may be so focused on the investigation. And so each local agency, I think, they have that responsibility to figure out what those processes are. But again, if you're in a state that doesn't allow release of body worn camera in certain situations, we have to be able to explain that. And I would say certainly getting out ahead of that. There are some cases where the prosecutor says, no, it can't be released, and we're working with the prosecutor. But these are all conversations that we try to have early on and explain a lot of times to reporters so they can convey that accurately. I know a lot of times that's what I end up having to do, get on the phone and explain, hey, this is what's going on, because it's an active case. The prosecutor saying it can't be released, or the local agency might decide to go ahead and put it out. But it varies a lot. There's not one uniform way of doing it, but you got to be in a position to explain it as soon as possible.
Cameron, go ahead.
So a couple things I wanted to kind of reference is, the concept of not only releasing when you can, putting out what you can when you can, but also thinking about putting body worn camera footage out there proactively, not just when you have to, or you're getting the pressure to, or there's a major critical incident. I worked with an agency, a client a couple years ago, who the chief was great at coming to me and saying, hey, I know that we're going to have a time where we're going to have to release it. And I don't want that to be the first time we're showing up to our community, because they're not used to us putting stuff out there. We're not a busy agency. So why don't we highlight a success story of something that happened where officers used their training, was able to de-escalate and prevent a situation that could have potentially been bad from happening by putting stuff out there. They also use it as an opportunity to educate the public on some of the practices and things that officers can and can't do. So it's showing up proactively. It's taking the opportunity to educate people and give them context as to why officers do and don't do things. And I think that that's a great idea for agencies who maybe don't have a lot of major incidents happening all the time, to maybe try out. That might be a technique. The other part of it is, if you are not putting stuff out there, maybe you're trying to fly under the radar. You're not, releasing and producing critical incident videos, but other agencies are. Eventually, it's going to come back to you. And locally here, just a couple weeks ago, we had a county here that dealt with 5 very significant critical incidents and incidents that didn't go over so well, that caused some major issues with public trust, and really a call for transparency. And I do have to give San Bernardino County props for how they handled it. They put out everything that they could when they could, day of or day after. It was such a swift response, a transparent response. Meanwhile, an agency within the county continued a practice of not releasing footage, of asking for extension after extension. And people caught on to that, of saying, hey, I'm hearing there's stuff going on in this city. Why are they not putting out there? So on the front line of the biggest paper out here stood the story of the sheriff's department putting out what they should have, and then also calling out the city within that county saying, hey, how many times are you guys going to push past, which, like Katie said, 45 days? I mean, that is way too late. That is ridiculous in my opinion. And now they're doing extensions, hoping that it'll go away. And, you know, that's not something that you want to be put in a position, because now they're going to go back and request, which is what's happening, all their previous footage, and they're going and pushing past the deadlines. And you know what's brewing right now. They're going to come after them and be critical when they could have just owned things and put it out there in the first place.
Right. Go ahead, Katie.
I just want to ask a follow-up question to that, Tamron. What about setting precedent with releasing, let's say, proactive or positive footage, and then what happens if an agency chooses not to release footage in a questionable stop or a questionable use of force? That's when they enact, you know, the withholding due to investigative reasons. How would leaders and PIOs, I guess, address that? Or is that where it's best to have policies in place for, once you start the ball rolling on releasing body cam footage, you treat everything the same?
I don't think that there would be a blanketed approach to this. So for example, the video that we put together, there was somebody who was making threats to do suicide by cop, had clearly struggled with mental health issues and mental health history, could have gone very bad. And we'd even seen similar circumstances where it went bad. And officers were so compassionate, remembered contacting him before, related and said, hey, remember I contacted you not too long ago? That was you, right? See, I'm here again, I'm helping. And it's showing that compassion, showing the training, showing the de-escalation. And that, I think, being proactive with that, and not with every incident of that type, that you're building that trust proactively, the trust, that they know that when you can release something, you will, and that you're not against it. But sometimes there are circumstances where you have to, you know, push beyond what they would expect. But they also know, because they've seen you step up and be transparent, that they're going to trust that you're going to put something out there as soon as you can. So I don't think a policy blanketed would be the right approach, but just making sure that you're taking each circumstance case by case and providing an explanation or context to why you would or wouldn't put something out there.
Does anybody else have anything to add? They'd like to add?
I do,
Go ahead,
if I may, Robert.
Go ahead.
I think, yeah, and Tamron and Katie bring up great points. Everybody brought up great points on this specific part of the discussion. I would add and offer for consideration that if an agency is proactively putting out these, especially body-worn camera videos, and then they do have an incident where it's something they don't want to put out, that agency runs a big risk of being seen as incongruent and inconsistent in what they're doing. I think if an agency can be at least mostly consistent, and yes, some of that can be explained, certainly, but I think it's just something that agencies need to draw a balance with, as far as finding that correct way to manage that, whether it's policy driven or common practice, or even on a case by case basis. But it is a risk that is ran, that if you're going to put out all this body worn camera video on all these incidents, and I understand the reasoning for that, and I concur with that. I get that. I support that. It's you're going to have to do the same when an incident happens that you may not want out there for whatever reason that may be. So it's somewhat of a double-edged sword, and something I think agencies need to take into consideration. Also, I think reverting back to state law, if there's a state law in place, obviously that needs to be followed. And hopefully our state legislators are smart, and when they're passing legislation and not reacting to something. Here in the state of Indiana, our legislators did exactly that. They crafted what's a pretty good statewide law on release of body worn camera video. So just want to offer those things for consideration for agencies that are thinking about what they're going to do with their body worn camera videos.
Katie, you brought up, I think it was Katie that brought up, Nellie, you brought up critical incident videos. One of the things that I've seen so much more is the production of critical incident videos in regards to an officer-involved shooting, an officer-involved use of force, and they're very in-depth. The previous agency I used to work at, they put out several of them when we had officer-involved shootings, where we defined the policy. We showed where the body camera was mounted on the person's vest, and then of course the video in its format with mapping and all that. What are your thoughts, everyone, about agencies being that detailed and putting information out on a video about a critical incident that occurred? I think it adds a lot of context, and I believe they had a policy at the time. I believe it was 21 days from the incident, 21 days, and it had to be produced and out. Thoughts? Oh, you guys are all quiet on me. Okay.
I thought somebody else was going to go. Sorry.
All right. So I guess, I think it's a good idea. I think we should have some. Nellie, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I didn't bring that up. I mean, it may have been Tamron or Katie. I mean, the main thing I was going to say, I have seen it. That's not a practice that is common in my state. I've seen other agencies. I've been at training conferences where that's done. And I think that it is an expectation that has been built within that community. They started to do it. I mean, it's very, very open. I haven't seen many drawbacks that I'm aware of. I just always wonder, when you're looking at there are open investigations. So I'm still kind of watching to see when you start adding context to something, because I'm much more used to putting something out and not adding anything. I don't want anyone to look and say, oh, well, they're just spinning it and they're trying to explain things away. So that's the thing that I'm evaluating. I have seen some of that, and we're still kind of seeing how that works for those communities.
Well, I would say this: they're not adding any information more into the video itself. They're just basically putting out everything that they can to show people this is where it occurred at by giving a map, showing what their policy is, and then showing the video from start of incident to end. They're not changing, altering, or editing anything out. They don't do any of that, although they have been accused of it in the past. And the funny thing is the videos are literally nonstop, so it's hard to show that it's just been a cut and a splice. Go ahead, Katie.
I do want to add, Tamron brought up, and kind of the question that I raised was about like precedent, especially legally, with putting body camera footage out. And I was trying to think of ways in which Tamron was providing examples of, something continual to build up that expectation that we will tell the story of good calls, or you talk about good training, things like that, to visually show people what works well. And then when the time comes to share information, because it's a critical incident, the expectation is already set that footage will be a part of that package. I remember Arlington Police, under at the time Deputy Chief Chris Cook, they did, I want to say it was like Footage Friday or something alliterative, where they would find maybe it was the body camera footage of the week. Maybe that's what it was. And every week they would ask their teams so therefore they had an investment in the story to tell of a good call or something fun or something different that just created that normative behavior of release. And some of that footage, was routine. It was like, here's what, a traffic stop looks like or something like that. So then they were also getting a bird's eye view from the body cam footage of how the officers interacted with the community, things like that. So they set that expectation. Some of it ended up making national news. I remember there was a call where there was a person dressed in a costume, and it scared the officer so bad he screamed like a girl. And it was just so funny, but it was so real. And then, when they did have critical incidents, the release was the same. And so that's a good example of what that agency did, to Tamron's point of telling the story with footage before you have that baptism by fire situation of a place to go look and see what that looks like on a consistent basis.
I think that it's important to have consistency. Go ahead, Tamron.
One thing I did want to mention, which Nellie, you had brought up, is how things are edited, right? If you have an incident where there's 15 officers and they're doing interviews for hours and hours, trying to package that in a way that doesn't change content or doesn't change the story, doesn't look like you're altering or justifying, but then how do you also paint the picture? And that's hard, because my team does that for a lot of agencies. And we had one incident where we had to go through, and it was a major active shooter situation at a festival and you had 50 officers there, and it was a nightmare to go through and try and package and redact and all of that. But one of the things that I unfortunately have seen and have had to step up and push back for, or have had PIOs reach out to me, is departments being intentionally selective in what footage they put out there. And I'm just going to say it how it is. They're doing exactly what they accuse the media of doing. They're spinning the story. They're changing the story for their benefit instead of looking at it from a factual standpoint. They're leaving things out. I've had people call me and say, hey, we're editing this, and they're telling me to not use this. And what they're not remembering is your edited version does not meet the law requirements of what can be released. So what happens when they get a hold of the 15 officers that each have 3 hours and they go through it and they start going, that's weird. You left this off, or how come you didn't show this angle? And then now what happens? You've completely lost all trust. Transparency will never be a word associated with your organization. And so it is a balance of how do you tell the story in the best way, proactively, without doing it in a way that's going to make people think or believe that you are changing the story, whether intentional or not.
You know what? I agree with you, Tamara, and I think that's an important distinction to make. Chicago PD recently released video from the Dexter Reed shooting, and that was where this made national news. The officers fired 96 rounds at this vehicle and this person involved in this shooting. What I think the context that came out of this is the media took 96 shots that were taken, but they didn't take into account the logistics of this shooting. There was a vehicle in the way. There were officers all the way around the vehicle. The shooter that was originally shot, the first officer, was still in the vehicle and then exited the vehicle and then eventually collapsed behind the vehicle. So you have 4 officers running, or 5 officers running in different directions for cover while they're being shot at. And the media said, they shot 96 times. Well, the problem is you have a lot of different things that are going on there, including the potential for somebody thinking they're being fired on with friendly fire occurring. Go ahead, Nellie.
What this conversation is really making me realize a lot of times what happens, at least from what I've seen with body-worn camera, we're really great, I think, a lot of times of writing our news release and putting the information out. But sometimes, and you know how it goes, these stories, they start to catch more attention than maybe just your local community. And then people start asking a bunch of questions. And guess what? They just do not believe your words. Your words mean nothing. So there have been a number of times, even though we are an investigative agency and that's our core focus, is that we've released body cam because truthfully, there have been so many questions and it was only the body cam that could answer those questions. And so you could see that what we're putting out. And so after the body cam is released, it's like, okay, well, it's done. We've moved on. And I think that that's what body cam can do when we're talking about transparency.
Okay, let's move on here. I think we've covered a lot on this, and let's go on to the next question. The next question covers communication and perception of law enforcement actions. And Cameron, how can law enforcement agencies improve communication of their actions to ensure that the public's perception aligns with the reality of policing?
This is a tough one because, we talked about educating, right? Educating the public, educating internally. And it really does come down to that. But we also have to be realistic and understanding that no matter what we do, there are going to be people that are going to assume, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Assume that an officer's actions, were unlawful. Just because they don't know. I actually had somebody messaging me over an incident that had happened and it looked like they did a Google search and were trying to cite laws and penalties and make a case for how they felt that something should have been handled legally. And it's crazy to me. And and you always got to love when people jump in for you and have your back. And I said, okay, I'm gonna let this simmer. And people are going, what, did you get your law degree at the University of Google? But that honestly is what people think is they read something, someone told them something, they go and they do a Google search, or they apply one concept from one situation blanketly across any situation that occurs. So I think that one of the things that we can continue to do is educate people. Even something as grassroots as our Citizen Academy programs. How many times is putting people through scenarios and having officers walk them through a high-risk traffic stop where you see those light bulbs go off? And those are the people that are vested in your community who are going to be the ones that are going to stand up for you if something happens, or get back at those trolls in the comments that are questioning you because they actually know and took the time to learn. Even being part of community groups and being involved with stakeholders that can amplify your voice and help kind of have your back. And I think that just the foundation of educating people and over again, because one incident's going to happen, and then 3 months later, something's going to come up, and you're going to have to take that as an opportunity to educate people, whether it's in your news release, whether it's a media interview, or you're doing a video statement on Instagram, that you are making sure that you don't forget, yes, give facts, but also make sure that you are educating people on why officers did or did not do something.
Thank you, Tamron. Anybody like to add into that? Go ahead, Nellie.
One of the things that we're dealing with more recently, I understand that incidents happen and people might have their different perceptions of what probably happened in the incident, or what they think that happened, or they don't get it. There are a lot of movements that are going around, coordinated, not just local movements, not just national movements, but international movements, where these groups are intentionally creating stories, propaganda, and sharing it, and people are latching onto it. And it can be extremely scary because a lot of things that they put out are really inspiring some bad actors to harm law enforcement. And so what I have found lately is that, for me, like, the best time to tell a story and tell an agency story is when it's quiet, of course. And so just constantly pitching stories to media, constantly finding different stories within the agency. I just go around with what's happening today, so that we're constantly each day telling our story. So when that day comes where you're having to fight this propaganda and feel like you're in the middle of a war, you know that you have already built up this online reputation, because most of our issues are now, I mean, they happen online. They really don't, I don't have to really deal with, it's not the reporters that I really have most of the challenges with as far as creating these stories. It's really these stories online. And so I think it's just really important that every day we're spending time to find ways to tell that story, and just remember that when you're on there and you're moderating this content online, that there's just a few people screaming really loudly, okay? But what about the people that are not screaming, okay? The people that may be on the fence, that may not understand. You got to get in there and tell your story. Because when I found, even as a lobbyist under the dome, in my other capacity, I have legislators that they may not go online and scream about it, but because if you don't say anything, they're questioning it. They're just reading the propaganda. We don't want them to get pulled. So it's up to us to make sure that we're out there and every single day standing firm in who we are and what we do. So I think that I've become way more passionate about it, because before, it's one thing when someone says, oh, someone was shot unarmed in the back, and they want justice. I mean, it's a much more legitimate concern for me than a group of people who are just creating and making up these false stories. And the importance now more than ever, it's so important that we have those public information officers, those communicators that are there every day telling the story, to just obviously build the trust, but also to keep people safe.
And I think that's really important. I'll get to you in a second, Katie. I think it's really important that this is where the executives need to know they have to have an individual, that public information officer that's there, that is the person doing, not a part-time person, but the actual person that's doing it on a daily basis. Because without that person, you can't do it on a part-time basis. It just does not serve your agency very well. Katie, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. Nellie hit it on the head. Part of transparency is also the community, including your digital one, knowing that you are there to respond. and provide the education and the information and really speaking to that silent majority. We deal with the 10%ers, the 10% of people who love us and the 10% of people who hate us. But it's that 80% in the in-between who are watching and wondering what you're going to do and what you're going to say that truly matter, because that more often than not encompasses a bulk of your community that you actually physically serve. So to your point, Robert, it was, it means something to have leadership in an organization understand the weight or the gravity of how vital it is to have a real presence and somebody there on a continual basis to be able to respond, to be able to beat back those, outlandish claims. Our brains are lazy muscles. They are more inclined to believe the most illogical thing that they read on the internet than the most logical thing they are told by primary sources of information. And that requires a consistent and persistent effort on organizations' parts to be present, to maintain, and to ultimately overcome what potentially people on the internet are saying, because they know that that silent majority is going to be present when they need them most.
Thank you, Katie. Tamara, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to Nellie and Katie said some, they both really did a great job at providing examples and context and explaining that and bringing up such relevant points. One thing that I wanted to also bring up is I see so often that when people get attacked or questioned, or these groups come latch onto your page and now they're blowing you up, that there's the knee-jerk reaction to go silent, to turn off comments, to delete a post, that they don't know how to deal with that. And I get it's case by case. There are some times where it's just nonsense and it's, that it'll kind of settle itself. It's not worth responding to, but there are most of the times where it is appropriate, because your local community, even though these trolls are coming from 10 states over and coming and attacking your page, your local community is going, wait, is there weight to this? What's going on? How come you're not saying anything? And that you need to address it, not for the trolls, but for your audience, your constituents, your followers in your community that are wondering, what's going on here. And I think that you owe it to them to respond, and to simply go silent. It's frustrating to me when someone well, I'm just going to delete the post because everyone's trolling, and I'm just going to turn off comments on all of our posts. I'm going, that is the worst thing you can do, because it's like squeezing a balloon. They're going to find you're displacing their anger, their frustration. And I saw that happen with an agency who went and did that. And so their chief's desk was getting blown up. Dispatch was getting inundated where they couldn't even manage their priority calls coming in because they were getting trolled. People were showing up to the station. They were protesting because they had a small group that listened to them. And it was all because they went and ignored and shut them down, and they had something to say, and they made sure that there was a way to say it.
When you close down that connection, the ability to interact with the community, you really do a lot of damage to the brand of the agency. And when there was an agency in Florida that did this, where they stopped responding to people via social media, and I think it just opens them up for other. That's kind of like the absence of a response is chaos, because you allow people to create pages and act and say things without any ability to control or even correct misinformation.
Absolutely.
Adam, you're pretty quiet down there today. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to jump in on specific to the point that you referenced about, and Tamron as well, about the turning off the comments. I know we don't want to go too far off into the social media realm, but that is in essence having a one-way conversation. And nobody likes to be on the receiving end of a one-way conversation. And imagine standing up at a town hall meeting and saying, hey, listen, no microphones tonight, because we really don't want to hear what you have to say. We're just going to talk to you. Of course, that would never work. So one of the things I wanted to jump on in reference to something that Tara said, and that is, not only will that community and the 80% of your audience online wonder why you're not responding, another group that will also wonder why you're not responding are those inside your organization. Also wonder why are we not responding? Why are we not saying anything? And they'll begin talking among themselves behind the convenience stores at 2:30 in the morning and out in the parking lot before shift. And they're going to ask and wonder those things. And that also can create a branding issue, or really damage the brand and create a messaging issue that you don't want to really have at all. So I think Cameron brings that up. Not only, though, is it good for that external audience to hear what you're having to weigh in as you can. Appreciate that, for lack of a better term.
Thank you, Adam. Let's move on from this, and let's move on to the last question. That's a collaboration for enhanced transparency. Gary, how can public information officers work alongside community organizations and advocacy groups to foster transparency and address concerns about bias or fairness in policing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very wide encompassing. I wrote down kind of three main thoughts here as I was making some notes in my response. I think the biggest thing, in my experience anyway, that benefited me was to invest in those relationships up front, ahead of time, every day, making investments in those relationships. And what does that look like for your agency? That's investing in relationships within the media, within your community, with your faith-based organizations. I love earlier somebody on the panel brought up about citizens groups, citizens academy sessions. We've had such tremendous response and benefit to conducting our Citizens Academy sessions. If an agency isn't doing that, you should be. It's a great way to get to build community trust. The second part I considered is being available, and I know it's been mentioned before, but I'm going to reiterate it. Being available as the media contact, as the contact person for the public with your agency, being available and reachable. I can't tell you how many times I got complimented, and I'm honored for this by media and others, that, man, you're so available. Anytime we call, you respond. We email, we call, we text, whatever. You're so responsive. You could be right in the middle of a major incident, and you're going to respond and be available and be reachable. And I think that's a key. Where there's a lack of information, that information is going to get told. It's going to get shared, and if we're not participating in that, it's frequently going to be incomplete, told incorrectly, and nothing else, incomplete. The last of the three thoughts, fostering authenticity. I really like that word, authenticity. I would almost suggest that we think about replacing the term transparency with agency authenticity. What does that look like? If an agency has an incident and they need to take ownership of it, they need to take ownership of it right now, immediately, and get out ahead of that. That's been mentioned by others before, and I think they're spot on. Humanizing the profession. We've worked on that for a while now. We all kind of laugh about it for years. Our friends in the firefighting service are always everybody's best friend. Why is that? Well, they did a masterful job, and every time they do something, they publicize about it. They talk about it. Well, here the police are, who are usually the first responding agency to that particular incident, and did something before the firefighters got there. No offense to our friends in the firefighting service. We're just go about being quiet professionals. We don't talk about it. So I think humanizing the profession, and that also means that we're human beings that make mistakes on occasion, and we need to take ownership of that. And I alluded to before, but I'll say it again, telling our story. If we don't be a part of telling our own story, it will get told for us, usually incorrectly, or at a minimum incomplete. And we need to be proactive with that, invest in those things ahead of time. And then as a final thought, consistency and congruency, I think, are really big things. I think if we are consistent and congruent with what we are doing, I think many people will give us somewhat of the benefit of the doubt when we need that. And that's all in addition to the other things our panelists have rightly pointed out throughout the whole conversation here.
Thank you, Gary. I always call that the trust bank. If you do the right things all the time, you're talking to the media, you're talking to the public, you're being transparent as you can, you build up that trust bank. And when things do go bad, the community and those that are there will be a little bit more understanding, because they see you always being the authentic agency that you are.
I think making investments in that ahead of time, not just with our with media folks, but in the communities that we serve, being out there, being known, being seen, going to the community groups, doing the citizens academies, making all the investments that we make on a daily basis in our communities, that is so critical. And one of the greatest things is they know you, whether you're an agency head, whether you're a chief, deputy chief, the media person. They know Gary, they know Nellie, they know Adam. It's not just the agency, it's the people in the agency. They know us. And I think that builds that trust within your agency and within you, within us as representatives of our agencies.
I agree. Anybody like to add to that?
I really liked what Chief said. I think that for me, I don't think that I can do any of what you just asked, Robert, in the office. So I am constantly out in the communities with our local agency and the local communities doing just that and building that trust. One of the things that we'll find too, even within the community, is that there are a lot of families who've been victimized and they're hurting. And if they don't feel like they're getting their answers, or the police are being unfair, they'll go to the media, they'll take to social media. And so I make a real point that they know who we are. As a spokesperson for the agency, I get a lot of calls from families wanting updates, and I make sure that I link them where they need to go with the investigators for information. I have a specific story. It didn't happen in my agency, but it happened very recently, in a local sheriff's office where an inmate died. And to Chief's point about the PIO, well, the media person, the PIO for that agency, they were gone for maybe a day or 2 days. They did not turn an out of office reply on. They didn't let the media know how they can reach them. The media called them to ask about this inmate death because the parent, who happened to live in another state, was calling. They said they didn't have answers. And so there was no way for that reporter to get information from the agency. They went on, they did their story. I get a breaking news alert that says, family wants answers, agency is not speaking. I'm like, this agency, they always speak. What's going on? To find out, new PIO didn't turn an out of office reply, and they went on with the story. And you know who it hurt? The families hurt, but it hurt those deputies within those agencies, because how they were being characterized is not indicative of the work that they were doing. So we owe it, like Adam said earlier, internally, to do that. Even listen, this is an Our PIO podcast. I got an out of office reply. I don't want 1 hour to go by where a reporter's looking for me and they don't know who they need to contact. So they know who they need to contact if they want to know about what's happening at the GBI. So we need to be accessible. We need to communicate where they can get information on, because we're doing it for the public. We're doing it for the families. We're also doing it for our internal audience, our internal family.
Well said.
Thank you again. Thank you, Nellie. Anybody else like to add to this? Go ahead, Cameron.
Nellie, I love how you talked about the victims, because that they are so oftentimes they don't feel heard. They don't feel that anybody cares about them. They don't have a voice. And I think that is a huge area that we could do better at overall. But just to put something out there, some things that I had done that worked well, when it came to community, obviously all the things that you talked about were going to service club meetings. So I was part of the different service club groups, the Chamber of Commerce groups, the faith-based collaborative. And then even moving over to the media side, we did a media day where we invited in media to just do a tour. We let them do a ride along just to kind of give them a peek behind the curtain. And they absolutely loved that. And we also brought them in and did a department-wide management meeting where they can talk to the managers or the supervisors who they might encounter out on the street, who's the sergeant or the watch commander, to just have a face to the name, to understand like, hey, when I call you guys, I'm not the bad guy. I'm doing my job just like you're doing your job. And here's how you can help me. And then having the officers being able to explain, hey, this is why I sometimes can't give you something. So it was nice to kind of have a mediation session almost to bring them all together. So when they showed up at the scene the next time, they're like, hey, I remember you, with the local reporters. So that was something that I thought was so valuable to bring is just creating the relationship ahead of time so that we're not running into the tension or the issues later on down the road.
Thank you, Tamara. I think you summed that up really nicely. Thank you very much. All right, guys, we have hit our time. We've hit an hour, and I don't want to. You guys are very busy. I do not want to drag this out any longer. I think we hit some phenomenal responses to these questions, and you guys really, I think, nailed it to the head there with transparency and the importance of how an agency needs to really embrace transparency and not button down. I just saw an article. The Alabama State Legislature just rejected body-worn camera release time, required body camera releasing. So it's interesting where you still have states that are fighting against being transparent in this day and age. So I hope that everybody has found some clarity on the topic of transparency. It is my hope that you can take some of that information that you heard today to your agencies and share it and maybe enhance what you're currently doing. I'd like to thank our panelists for participating in today's discussion. For our audience, you will receive an email with a link to survey about today's discussion. If you take the time to complete the survey, it would only help us improve. And the full audio and video will be available on our YouTube channel and then later on our podcast channel. So go ahead and look for that. For those of you that had difficulty, I found a few of you. We found out today Safari does not work on this network. So those that are using Safari, I apologize, but you will be able to watch the whole thing coming very soon. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Honored
everyone.
to. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.